Hi, I'm Kate Christensen with 350 Colorado, and today we're going to talk to Dr. Amy Townsend-Small. She is an associate professor in environmental science at the University of Cincinnati. Together with her collaborators and students, she has published over 40 articles and raised over $2 million in research funding. Her current research focuses on atmospheric methane emissions from the oil and gas supply chain and climate change feedbacks. She also works on community engaged research toward environmental justice and greenhouse gas emissions reductions together with her students. Amy, thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited
Hi.
to talk to you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk in Colorado right now about how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the role the oil and gas sector plays in it, and stripper wells too.
Mhm.
And I just want to learn more about it. So let's start with stripper wells. Can you tell me what's a stripper well?
Yeah. So, good question. Sometimes they're called marginal wells.
Mhm.
Basically, they're the lowest producing oil and gas wells. I think they're called stripper wells because sometimes you can picture them like stripping the last bit of oil out of the oil reservoir. But they also can produce natural gas. And they're defined as producing less than 15 barrels of oil or oil equivalent, the natural gas equivalent of oil per day.
Cool. Can you help me get a sense of how many stripper wells are in Colorado, or
Mhm.
what percentage of our oil and gas wells are stripper wells?
Yeah, yep. About a little more than half of the oil and gas wells in Colorado are stripper wells. Of those, most of them are in the very lowest production category, which is um, 0 to 1 barrel of oil equivalent per day. And that's the category in the United States with the largest number of oil and gas wells. So, of the almost 9,000 wells in Colorado, there's more than 2,000 wells that are 0 to 1 barrel of oil equivalent per day.
Wow. So, I mean, to be clear, those are like just producing wells, not
Mhm.
the abandoned wells, not the plugged,
Correct.
not the
Exactly.
temporarily abandoned.
Yep.
Um, so it sounds like most of these wells that are producing oil are producing a tiny, tiny bit of oil. Does
Right.
that also mean they're not producing greenhouse gases like methane or carbon dioxide or VOCs?
Good question. That's actually a common misconception. These marginal or stripper wells are what our research and other studies have recently found is that they're emitting a much higher proportion of their natural gas than newly drilled or higher producing wells. So they're emitting a disproportionate amount of methane. And my students and I have done research on this and made measurements on stripper wells in Ohio and found that some of them are emitting more gas than they're actually producing.
So these wells are polluting more into the atmosphere than anybody's actually getting out of them to let
Exactly.
it burn and pollute.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Stripper wells sound crazy.
Yeah.
But why are there so many stripper wells producing all this methane?
A legacy of oil and gas extraction that started here in Appalachia back in the 1860s. So we also have a lot of wells that are no longer producing. Sometimes they're called abandoned or orphaned or legacy or idle wells. There's a lot of terms for the perhaps millions of wells that are no longer producing, that are old and dormant on the landscape. And many of these marginal wells are older and conventionally drilled wells. And they're expensive to mitigate. So the plugging process to end the life of the well is, from what I know, is a very expensive process. And I think oil companies may be reluctant to close that loop.
So there's no incentive for these companies to close the wells. And so they just
Mhm.
let them sit there and they're releasing methane
Yeah.
just into the atmosphere.
Yeah. And I am not an expert on the financial side of them or of the oil industry in general, but I do know there's a tax credit for marginal wells, a federal tax credit, and in some states, there's state level incentives for marginal wells.
I believe that's true in Colorado too. We have a tax credit for stripper wells.
Okay.
And I also believe that stripper wells are exempt from our methane rules.
Yeah, that's very common in most places that do have methane regulations. They call them existing sources. So, most of the methane regulations that do exist in states like Colorado or Pennsylvania, or even the federal regulation that briefly existed and now is being reconsidered, would only apply to newly drilled wells. That's right.
Wow. So there's a couple studies I was looking at in Colorado. One is that if we don't do anything different, Colorado will only reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 3.5% by 2030.
Okay.
And our goal is 50%. So another thing I was looking at is a recent New York Times article that reported on a study that showed that some of the biggest national methane emitters are right here in Colorado.
That's right.
And I I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So that article you mentioned showed that some of the largest oil companies that have big name recognition, like Exxon, for example, one of the ways that they've worked on reducing their methane emissions is by selling low producing marginal wells that are their highest methane emitters to other companies. And that helps on the books reduce methane emissions from those companies. But of course, the methane emissions still exist in the atmosphere. They're just transferred to a different company.
So, real quick, because we didn't touch on this, we
Mhm.
always talk about CO2 emissions as greenhouse gases, but how does methane compare to carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas?
Okay, good question. It's a greenhouse gas as well. It's more powerful than CO2, especially right after it's emitted. So it has a short atmospheric lifetime, and over a 20-year time period after it's emitted, it has 86 times the global warming potential of CO2. So what that means is if there's a sudden increase in methane emissions, say from increased reliance in natural gas, such as what we're doing right now in the United States, like a natural gas boom, that could increase the rate of climate warming. Burning natural gas also creates CO2. So it's a fossil fuel just like oil and coal, or burning methane creates CO2. And natural gas, just to back up even more, is usually about 90 to 95% methane.
You talked about these really high emitting stripper wells that are producing a teeny tiny bit of oil that no one wants to close because they're expensive
Yes.
and they have tax credits
Yeah.
that keep them open.
Mhm.
And you mentioned idle wells, that there's, or temporarily abandoned, shut in, all these wells that are not producing anything,
Right.
and they're still emitting methane as well.
Right. Some of
Um,
them are.
some of them are. Could you talk a little bit about the wells that aren't producing any gas at all as
Sure.
far as like to make money with? Are they still producing greenhouse gases?
Yeah, abandoned wells are another problem. They're, I would say, in my experience, they're a smaller methane source than active wells, including marginal wells, but still can be a methane source. Some of them are a more substantial methane source than others, and there's a lot of them. Some estimates of the nationwide abandoned well problem put it in the millions. So, because some of them are undocumented, that no one knows where they are or how to find them.
Wow. So it seems like though, and I want your expert opinion on this, if we started plugging and abandoning some of these idle wells and especially some of these low producing wells, we could help take care of some of our greenhouse gas emission.
Yeah. Yes, especially if you focus on low producing or stripper wells, because you could um, mitigate methane emissions without really impacting our nation's energy supply. So I think that would be a solution that most people would agree would be a good idea, because they're not contributing significantly to our oil or natural gas supply. And these companies are benefiting from a lot of loopholes, as you mentioned.
So closing those loopholes could potentially be an incentive
That's
to
correct.
close these wells. I'm
Yep.
also wondering if it could, and this is speculation, could create more jobs for oil and gas workers.
Yeah, other people have been working on that issue of creating like a workforce for well plugging. So that's another possibility. Yes.
Yeah, if we have millions of wells
Mhm.
that need to be plugged,
That's right.
and I think I read in the Houston Chronicle 200 oil and gas companies that went out of business in 2020.
That's right.
It seems like
Yeah,
a win-win.
that's right. It could be.
All right. Is there anything else? Is there anything we missed? Any like important points that you feel like just we in Colorado should know about all these stripper wells that are emitting methane, or all these um, temporarily abandoned, shut-in, idle wells that aren't doing anything and still emitting methane?
Yeah, I just want everyone to keep in mind that they're not just emitting methane, they can also emit toxic air pollutants beyond methane. I know the Denver area has been struggling with air quality issues, and there's a large number of conventionally drilled marginal wells and abandoned wells in in the Front Range. Um, so, if you want to get a hold on ozone pollution, marginal wells need to be part of the solution, in my opinion, because um, hydrocarbons from oil and gas are precursors for ozone formation, and they can cause health problems. So they emit harmful air pollutants that can create health problems for people if they live near them. So, they should be quantified at any rate. And I know fracking has gotten a lot of attention for those reasons in your area. And they also, in my experience looking at these marginal wells in Ohio, can be spilling oil or produced water on the ground. So if they're not being inspected, they could be doing those things as well. And I know you have, water stress in your area too.
Yeah, we're if almost it seems like in an endless drought. But
Exactly.
also, you're totally right about the ozone. We've been in the EPA
I know.
non-attainment
Not
area for a
again.
long time,
I know.
and that we've had an F minus grade
Mhm.
from the American Lung
I know.
Association. So like, let's close some of these wells.
Oh,
Oh man. This
Yeah,
is
I
like a
mean,
solution that's a win-win-win.
exactly. It really would be. Yeah. So, and it's frustrating that, marginal wells just stay under the radar and there's so many of them, over half of the wells.
Yeah, that's hugely important.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for helping to
You're
like
welcome.
raise our awareness and bring this to our attention. And maybe we can take some steps to clean up our air and clean up our environment.
Exactly.
Keep
Yeah,
everyone
no
healthy.
problem.
All right. Thanks so much, Amy.
Okay.